Hyde Park, London. 5:17 a.m. October. The wind whispered softly through the old oak trees. The sky was still dark and the morning mist settled in thin layers on the stone benches. The pigeons had not yet awakened. Everything remained in silence. Edward Grayson tightened the collar of his wool coat as he turned onto the familiar cobblestone path in the park. His high leather boots made a sound as soft as breathing on the carpet of fallen leaves. Though he was 56, he still cut a tall, dignified figure, the image of an old-fashioned businessman, reserved, punctual, and averse to drawing attention. This was his favorite time of day, when the world had yet to stir, when memories still rested quietly at the bottom of the mind. He usually walked a loop around the park, then returned home to brew coffee, read the news, and dive into work. A routine maintained for the past 3 years ever since that fateful day. But this morning was different. As he neared the bench under the large canopy tree, a secluded spot few people visited, he stopped. At first, he thought someone had left a pile of old clothes behind. But then it moved. He stepped closer, cautiously, slowly. On the stone bench lay a girl, no more than 20, curled up on her side, hair matted, face streaked with dirt. Next to her were 3 newborns, so tiny he initially mistook them for discarded dolls. But then one of them stirred, a tiny arm stretching out from beneath a thin blanket. A cry not loud, but frail, pierced the morning stillness. Edward stood frozen. His first feeling wasn't pity, it was shock. Instinctively, his mind kicked into its usual gear. These are children. Possibly in danger. I need to act. He immediately pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. I'm in Hyde Park, near the south entrance. A young girl and 3 newborn infants. She's unconscious, showing signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. When the dispatcher advised him not to touch them without medical training, Edward ended the call but remained standing there, unwilling to take his eyes off the babies. They weren't screaming. Just soft, weak whimpers, little mouths sucking at the air as if searching for milk. The thin blanket wasn't enough to keep them warm. One of them began to shiver. Edward took off his coat and gently wrapped it around all 3, ignoring the advice he'd just received. He couldn't stand by and watch them turn blue from the cold. He couldn't help but think of Anna, his daughter, when she was a baby, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. The ambulance arrived after 8 minutes, the longest 8 minutes of his life. At St. Mary's Hospital, the situation turned urgent. Doctors admitted 4 patients, a girl suffering from severe dehydration and 3 malnourished infants. Edward refused to leave the hospital. Though he wasn't family, he insisted. I'm the one who found them and called for help. I'll take responsibility if needed. The nurse looked at him, unaccustomed to seeing a man dressed like a CEO standing in the pediatric emergency ward at dawn, his face full of worry. Sir, what is your relationship to them? None, Edward replied. But I think I need to be someone right now. 5 hours later, the girl was still unconscious. The babies had been warmed, hydrated, and placed in incubators. The doctors said their lives were no longer in danger, but if they had been found just a few hours later, the outcome would have been very different. Edward sat alone in the relatives' waiting area. In his hands was a temporary medical file, simply labeled. Patient name, unknown. Estimated age, 17 to 19. Infant names, undetermined. Through the glass, he could see the 3 tiny figures, peaceful under the soft light. A faint ache stirred in his chest. One question kept echoing in his mind. Who is she and what could have happened to drive someone so young to raise 3 babies in a park in the middle of autumn? A pale white light poured through the hospital room window, making Elise squint. Her eyelids felt as heavy as stone, but her body was strangely light, as if she no longer belonged to this world. The sharp scent of disinfectant stung her nose, mingling with the steady beeping of a heart monitor. She didn't know where she was. She only knew one thing: she had to find the babies. She tried to sit up, but her entire body ached. Her limbs were limp. She opened her mouth, but only a dry groan escaped. A figure stood up from the chair beside the bed, an older man with salt and pepper hair, wearing a dark blue shirt. His face was stern, but his eyes were warm. You're awake, he said gently, his voice as soft as the breeze. Elise's eyes widened. She glanced around the room quickly, panic rising. The babies, where are the babies? She gasped, her voice trembling with fear. They're safe, he reassured her. Being cared for in the neonatal unit. The nurses said they've had milk. Don't worry. Elise tried to sit up again, but as soon as her back lifted off the pillow, a wave of dizziness crashed over her. She fell back onto the bed, gasping for air. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room. The man stepped back, not interfering. Elise turned her head toward him, still wary. Who are you? She asked. The question wasn't hostile, but it was cold. Cold like a wall built after too many falls. After a brief pause, the man replied, I found you in the park. I called for help. I followed the ambulance here. Elise said nothing, her eyes unreadable. She wasn't used to kindness, especially not from men who appeared kind. They always wanted something in the end. She had learned that far too early. They didn't speak much that day. Elise was exhausted and just wanted to see the babies, but the doctors wouldn't allow it yet. They took her blood, gave her fluids, ran physical exams while the nurses collected her personal information. Elise gave her name, Elise Laurent. 18 years old. No fixed address. Dropped out of school in the middle of 11th grade. Her mother had died giving birth to the triplets, Clara, Theo, and Liam. Her stepfather left after the funeral. Since then, Elise had cared for the babies on her own. No family. No home. No money. When the social worker arrived around noon, Edward was asked to leave the room. Though he had no right to intervene, he waited outside the hallway, uneasy. Inside, Elise sat across from a middle-aged woman in a gray blouse who spoke gently but with legal weight behind her words. They asked Elise about her parents, her situation, her plans for the future. They emphasized that caring for 3 newborns was beyond the ability of an unhoused, unemployed girl who hadn't finished high school. Elise listened to each word like it was a blade carving into her. She knew they were just doing their job, but still, she felt judged, measured, weighed. And she was far too familiar with that feeling. They asked if she would consider placing the babies into foster care. Elise didn't answer right away, but her eyes said enough. When she stepped out of the room, her face was hard. But in her reddened eyes, Edward saw the silent scream of someone deeply wounded. They want to separate me from them, she said, her voice flat. They say it's for their own good. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded slightly. They're right if they only look at your current situation. But they don't know you kept them alive for 3 months. On your own. Elise gave a short laugh. It was hard to tell if it was bitter or just tired. You think I should give up too? I think, Edward said slowly, you've done what even many adults wouldn't be able to do. I don't have advice. Only, if you need someone to stand by you right now, I'm here. She frowned, narrowing her eyes at him as if trying to read the truth in his words. What do you want from me? Nothing. No one gives something for nothing. Especially not men. I know that. Maybe, Edward replied calmly, but maybe this time things are a little different. Later that day, Elise was allowed to visit her siblings in the neonatal unit. She leaned against the wall, walking slowly down the cold hallway. When the door opened, she stopped and stood still. 3 incubators. 3 tiny bodies wrapped in blankets, their skin a pale pink, their chests rising and falling with faint breaths. For the first time in weeks, they were sleeping. Not crying. Not shivering. Not being chased away by wind or strangers. Elise stepped forward and placed her hand gently on the incubator glass. Her eyes blurred with tears. Her lips moved slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. Edward stood outside the hallway looking through the thick glass. In a moment of quiet, his gaze met Elise's. No words were spoken, but something had changed. Not pure trust. Not complete belief. But the first step. A tiny crack had opened between 2 strangers. And through that crack, a faint sliver of light slipped in. The news broke on Monday morning. A headline blazed across the homepage of an online tabloid. Billionaire Edward Grayson rescues homeless girl and 3 infants in Hyde Park. Within 4 hours, more sensationalized versions began to circulate. Grayson heir to adopt abandoned triplets? 3 babies. What's the real story behind this unusual act of charity? Fairy tale or PR stunt? When Edward stepped out of his office in London's financial district that afternoon, 2 reporters were already waiting at the company gate. One thrust a microphone forward. Mr. Grayson, is it true you're planning to adopt the 3 abandoned babies? Please confirm. Another chimed in. What's your relationship with the girl, Elise Laurent? Is she your illegitimate daughter? Edward said nothing. He tightened his grip on his briefcase and silently got into his car. At the hospital, Elise was bottle-feeding Clara. She sat slumped in a chair, her head lowered, tousled hair falling softly on her cheeks. Her face no longer looked as pale as the day before, but her eyes remained tense as though she feared someone would appear at any moment to take the babies away. A nurse entered, phone in hand. News about you and Mr. Grayson is online now, she said, handing the phone to Elise. Elise took it. Her expression darkened as she read the comments. Another gold digger who caught a big fish. No way those kids are really her siblings. Scam alert. Too dramatic to be true, totally staged. She set the phone down, whispering through clenched teeth. Bastards. The nurse said nothing. She simply placed a gentle hand on Elise's shoulder and gave it a soft squeeze. The next day, representatives from social services arrived. This time, there were three: a case supervisor, a young attorney, and a family assessment officer. They were polite, but distant, as if Elise were just another case file in a long queue of problems to process. "We need to determine whether Ms. Elise Laurent is mentally and legally capable of continuing to care for the three infants," the lawyer began. Edward was present, seated across the table, silent. "You have no permanent residence, no income, and you haven't completed your basic education. This is considered a high-risk situation," the supervisor added. "We recommend placing the children in temporary care with scheduled visitation." Elise remained still. Her hands under the table were clenched so tightly they turned white. "So I kept them alive through 3 months of freezing cold, with no food, no sleep, and now you're telling me I'm unfit?" she said, her voice trembling but sharp. "Legally speaking, yes," the assessor replied curtly. "And you think your system is better? You know how many of those shelters are full of abuse? Or do you just see abandoned property and start dividing it up?" The room went silent. Elise leaned forward, voice shaking with passion. "I didn't abandon them. I was just tired. Just a little. I didn't collapse from failure. I collapsed from exhaustion. And him," she pointed to Edward, "he's not someone I begged for help. He's the one who stopped when everyone else kept walking." Edward said nothing, but he looked at her with eyes like thawed ice, cold, clear, and full of pain. After further discussion, the social service team granted a 14-day provisional period during which Elise would stay at a temporary residence provided by Edward pending approval, attend regular psychological counseling sessions, present a viable long-term plan for childcare, education, or employment. If these conditions were not met, legal custody would be transferred to the state. That evening, seated across from Edward at his dining table in a spacious home with classical decor, Elise quietly ate vegetable soup and bread. She clutched her spoon as though afraid it might disappear. "I don't like owing anyone," she said without looking up. "This isn't a debt," Edward replied calmly. "But I still owe you." "I once owed a debt too," he said, looking at her. "A woman saved my daughter from drowning 12 years ago. I never got her name. But today I think I may have found her daughter." Elise looked up, eyes wide. Edward didn't elaborate. He stood and refilled her glass of water, his voice as soft as the early breeze. "There's still much I don't know about you. But if you want to stay, not out of obligation, but for a real chance, I'll do the rest." She didn't reply. But when she returned to the nursery that night, she paused at the edge of the crib. The three babies slept soundly, their cheeks pink and warm. For the first time in months, Elise didn't have to sleep beside them in the cold, guarding them from the wind. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe even just a little that maybe things could change. Edward Grayson's house stood on a quiet street in South Kensington, shielded from the noise of the city. The classical interior was well-kept, yet almost too silent, lonely. European landscape paintings lined the staircase, a piano sat untouched, and a child's room had been closed for 3 years. Elise woke at 6 a.m., a reflex born of months on the streets. She padded quietly down the hallway and peeked into the nursery. The babies were still asleep, peaceful. No crying from the cold. No coughing fits to jolt them awake. She sat beside the crib, gently pressing her hand to Clara's forehead. Warm. Her heart eased. Downstairs, Edward had already been awake. On the table before him was an old wooden box, lightly dusted. He hadn't opened it in years. But last night, when Elise mentioned her mother's name, Isabelle Laurent, something stirred in his memory. That name wasn't unfamiliar. He opened the box. Inside were keepsakes from his daughter, Anna Grayson. Photos, letters, and a small newspaper clipping. Logistics staffer saves 6-year-old girl from drowning at Grayson Corp event. A short article, but enough to bring it all back. 12 years ago. An end-of-summer company picnic. It was the last public event Edward ever let Anna attend. The venue was a resort near Brighton, a pool, a barbecue, games. In a moment of carelessness, Anna, only 6, slipped and fell into the water while running near the edge. No one saw it happen. Except one person. A logistics staffer, Isabelle Laurent, didn't shout, didn't call for help. She simply dove into the pool, fully clothed. By the time Edward realized what had happened, Anna was already coughing on the shore, alive. That day, he thanked Isabelle in passing, handed her an envelope, and praised her publicly. But like so many busy people, he quickly moved on. He never followed up. Never remembered her face. Never looked again. Not until now, when Isabelle's daughter, Elise, stepped into his life, did everything come rushing back like a wave. That afternoon, Edward quietly drove to West London to the old site of Grayson Logistics. The building was worn, the sign faded, doors locked. but he knew the employee files were still stored inside. He searched them himself through hundreds of names, until he found it. Isabel Laurent, Department, Logistics, Tenure, 2008 to 2015. A small staff photo was attached. Brown eyes, dark hair, a gentle smile. He recognized her immediately. And for the first time in years, Edward Grayson sank to the cold warehouse floor, curled around that photograph, clutching it to his chest. Isabel, the woman who had saved his daughter's life. The woman who had died giving birth to 3 children who now lay sleeping in his house. And Elise, the girl he might have walked past, if not for a foggy morning in the park. When Edward returned home, Elise was preparing formula. She heard the door open, glanced at him, said nothing. Edward hesitated, still holding the photograph. "Did your mother ever mention a company picnic?" he asked. "A time she saved a little girl from drowning?" Elise frowned, pausing mid-motion. "No, she didn't. My mom didn't talk much, especially after my half-brother died from a fever. After that, she shut down." Edward sat down, thoughtful, then placed the photo on the table. Elise stared, stunned. Her eyes welled up. "I believe your mother worked for my company. And she saved my daughter's life. Anna survived, but only for 2 more years." His voice broke. "She died in a car accident. I wasn't there. I was in a meeting in New York." Elise bit her lip. Part of her wanted to shut down, put her defenses back up. But another part, softer, more vulnerable, saw Edward not just as a wealthy man, but as a grieving father. Someone carrying a pain as deep as hers. "My mom would probably smile knowing you didn't turn away from me," she whispered. Edward looked at her. In his weary eyes, something had shifted. It was no longer pity, no longer duty, but a debt repaid the only way left. By giving a second chance to the daughter of the woman who once saved his own. That night, as Elise rocked the babies to sleep in their newly prepared nursery, she watched them for a long time, and she thought, maybe just this once, she would let herself believe someone was here to stay, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but for something deeper, something her mother, if she were still alive, might have called a debt of fate repaid in kind. A crisp autumn morning. The sky was clear, but the air felt heavy. Elise stood outside the study room in the guest wing of Edward Grayson's home. Inside was a long wooden table, a few notebooks, a brand new laptop, and a woman, tall, slender, hair neatly tied back, named Ms. Hawthorne, an educational consultant Edward had hired privately. "We'll begin with a placement test," she said, her voice calm but no nonsense. Elise nodded and stepped inside without a word. Though she was clean, dressed properly, and seated in front of a sleek new laptop, the feeling of not belonging clung to her like a second skin. In her head, a single question pounded like a drum: am I good enough? Am I stupid? Are they just waiting to say, "I knew you couldn't do it"? 3 hours later, the test ended. Elise exhaled and put down her pen. Ms. Hawthorne gave a small nod and said only, "We'll begin proper lessons tomorrow. I don't need you to be brilliant right away. I just need you to be willing to learn." Strangely, those words made it just a little easier to breathe. On another floor of the house, Edward was meeting with a visitor, his personal attorney, Mr. Carter. "What's Elise's legal situation?" Edward asked as he poured tea, his tone as composed as if discussing routine business. "To be honest, still fragile," Carter replied. "She doesn't yet qualify for full custody." But he opened his briefcase and pulled out a file. "We can file for a joint temporary guardianship plan. You as the legal sponsor, she as the primary caregiver. If this arrangement is stable for 3 to 6 months, the court may consider transferring permanent custody." Edward didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window. The wind was picking up. He remembered Elise in those first few days, guarded, lost-eyed, and yet there was something in her gaze that reminded him of Anna. Strong, reckless, but so delicate, like something that could vanish at the lightest touch. "Do it," he said. "She deserves a chance." That afternoon, Elise was changing Liam's diaper when Nanny Ruth, Edward's longtime caregiver, walked in carrying 3 neatly folded outfits. "I thought the little ones could use something. A bit cuter," she said with a soft smile, placing the clothes on the crib. Elise paused, staring at the pastel onesie with a tiny giraffe printed on it. "These must be expensive," she murmured, still holding the thin cloth diaper in her hand. "Mr. Edward bought them." "No receipt coming your way," Ruth replied. Elise stopped what she was doing. For a moment, emotion flickered in her eyes. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind of smile from someone who hadn't experienced kindness in a long time. "I used to wrap them in old coats. Changed sleeping spots every night so no one would find us." "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Ruth said gently. But you also don't have to feel small. In this house, you're the one who decides everything for those children. Elise looked at her. From the beginning, Ruth had been the only one who didn't treat her like a troubled teen, not with pity, not with judgment. And those words, "you decide everything," tightened something in her chest. Not from pressure, but from the weight of finally being given control over her own life. 3 days later, Elise officially began homeschooling. Course subjects, advanced English, and even emotional regulation, the lessons she found the strangest. But each night, after the babies were asleep, she sat at her desk, typing slowly, word by word. One night, Edward passed by and saw the light still on in the study. He knocked softly. Elise turned, startled. "I just wanted to say good night," he said, in a tone that felt more like habit than intent. She nodded. But then, as if compelled by something deeper, she asked, "Do you think I can do it? I mean, really learn again, raise all 3 of them, and not fail?" Edward leaned against the doorframe. His voice was steady and low. "I don't know how far you'll go. But I know the woman who once saved my daughter wasn't someone who gave up easily. And you have her blood." Elise stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her desk. She didn't say anything. But the corner of her mouth curved just a little. Enough to show that his words, that simple faith, had soothed something deep and doubting inside her. That night, as she lay beside the cribs, Elise gently touched each of the babies' foreheads. One by one. She no longer whispered, "Just stay alive," like she used to on the streets. Now she said, "We're going to live. Not just survive, but really live with a future." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The house remained quiet, but not the cold, lonely kind of quiet. It was the stillness of a place slowly becoming home.